The first step for all versions of the Canmore Cuddle Boots and the Rocky Mountain Slipper Boots is to attach the toe to the boot top. So what you want to do first is mark the center of each piece. You can do that by folding it in half and placing a pin or a clip at the center. So that's at the center of the curve of the toe and the center of the curve in the middle of the boot top. And you're going to place the toe on top of the boot top and pin them together at that center spot. Next, you're going to pin the edges together. So you're going to curve the toe piece around and pin or clip the edges together. Now you can see that it doesn't lay nicely right now, but as you sew, you just kind of put a little tension on it. And even if you're working with wovens for the Rocky Mountain Slipper Boots, because these curves are on the bias, they will stretch a little bit. So you can just pull them until they match and then sew along those curves. And you're going to do the same on the other end. And then sew that together. Now, if you're having any difficulty, something that is very useful is to use double-sided wash-away tape. So instead of pins or clips at the corners, you can just put a small piece of tape there, and then it will stay together even as you're sewing. Because sometimes, while you're sewing, once you start to get closer, you have to take that away. Sometimes if you let go, it'll move off, and it'll be harder to get it to stay together while you're sewing. So the wash-away Wonder tape or any brand of wash-away tape can be very useful for this step. So after you've got the toe sewn, you're going to want to trim that seam allowance to reduce the bulk and increase the mobility on the foot. If you're working with wovens for the Rocky Mountain Slipper Boots, you'll want to do a narrow zigzag just to prevent some fraying. Generally with enclosed seams for wovens, you don't usually bother finishing them since they're not going to be seen, but because this one needs to be trimmed fairly close to the seam line, and will have some pressure on it, as the foot moves and stuff, it will have some pressure on that seam. It's a good idea just to do a little bit of a zigzag in order to prevent fraying. So the next step is to fold your boot like this and sew your back seam. Once you've got the back seam sewn, if you haven't already, you want to go back and repeat all these steps with your lining and your other boot. So next, if you're going to be doing a cuff, you want to fold your cuff right sides together and sew the side seam. Then you're going to flip the cuff wrong sides together. So it creates a small tube like this with no raw edges on the fold and the raw edges on the other side. You want to pin or clip it together at the seam, and then place a pin or a clip exactly across from that one, so you've divided it into two equal parts. Okay, so if you're doing the cuff, you're going to want to slip it on top of one side of the boot, which should be right side out. So the cuff should be against the right side of the fabric. And you want to line up the back seams together. Pin or clip them in place. Stretch that cuff to match the width of the top of the boot. And then put the other pin or clip in place as well. Next, you're going to slip the other part of the boot, in this case the lining, on top of that, and pin clip and sew through all of those layers around the top. You're definitely going to want to trim this seam after you sew it because it will be quite bulky. Now for this boot, I'm actually not using the cuff. So I'm going to take the cuff out and then just simply put the main boot and the lining boot right sides together, pin it at the back seam, and then I'm just going to sew around the top edge. Now these fabrics aren't terribly bulky, so I probably don't need to trim that seam, but if you're using something like Sherpa or a thicker fleece, then you definitely want to trim that seam. After that top seam is sewn, you can flip the boot right side out so that the lining and the main fabrics are wrong sides together. And you can see it's starting to look like a boot. All we're missing now is the sole. So before you attach the sole, you're going to want to baste these two layers together, which will make the next steps a whole lot easier. So you can just match up those seams. And then just baste around all of those edges. And now that those bottom edges are basted, you're ready to attach the sole. So when you are doing the exposed seam sole method, you want to start by basting your two sole pieces, lining and main, wrong sides together. So the right side of each fabric should be facing out. Put your wrong sides together and just baste around all the edges. When attaching it to the slipper, you want the boot to be lining side out. And you're going to mark the center of the heel and the center of the toe on both pieces. So what you can do is fold it in half, and that will make it easy to find the center. And same with the boot. There we go. And you're going to match up those centers. Pin or clip them together. Now this part can be a little bit tricky, especially when you're working with woven fabrics with no stretch. You're going to have to ease the sole into the boot top because the boot top is a little bit bigger, and that's what gives you the height to make room for the top of your foot. So I like to start at the heel and just kind of tuck the heel inside the curve. And do that on both sides. Tuck it inside. You want to kind of do the same thing around the toe and tuck it in. So as you can see, if you tuck the heel and the toe, the side should work out pretty flush. But if you're struggling at all, what you can do is run a long straight stitch along the curve of the toe and then just pull the threads a little bit to gather it just a wee bit. You're not going to see those gathers after you're sewing. It just kind of helps you place it in a little bit better. So once you've got the sole on, the next step is to trim that seam allowance to reduce the bulk. Before you do that, it's always a good idea, if you have the person who's going to wear the slipper handy, just to flip it right side out and try it on them. The slippers are symmetrical, which means that both left and right are the same. There is no left and right really. You can make them asymmetrical by just trying it on them and then seeing how much you need to add to the seam allowance on one corner of the boot to make it left or right. Personally, I do find it very difficult to tell which is left and right, even if you do sew it that way. So I wouldn't really recommend doing that for the pull-on boot, but for the zippered boot, you could do that because the zipper will tell you which one is left and which one is right.